panelists.
So, dear colleagues and students, I'd like to welcome you all to this event to mark the launch of the book Indian Economy from Nehru to Modi by my departmental colleague, Professor Pulapre Balakrishnan. On behalf of the university and the Department of Economics, I welcome you all, and I also thank the panelists here who have agreed to be a part of this event and will be discussing this book. I particularly thank Dr. Arun Kumar, who has taken the time out to come to the show, and I believe he has to travel for 3 hours to Gurgaon. So thank you, Professor Kumar, and welcome to the show. And finally, I greatly appreciate the fact that the Chopra University Economic Society has organized this event. So I commend and congratulate them. So I will take too much of your time, any more of your time, because I'm sure all of us are waiting for this discussion, which I'm sure will be an enlightening one for all of us who are interested in the way the Indian economy has evolved since then. So we are all looking forward to this discussion. Thank you, and over to the panel.
Yes, Professor Kumar, if you could start with the So I must begin by congratulating Professor Balakrishnan on this book, which I've gone through with, a lot of excitement, so to say, because it covers a vast ground. So this book is for an intelligent reader on the occasion of 75 years of India's independence, and it assesses how much the country has succeeded in delivering the goal of the India's independence. To achieve that economic development was crucial, as the author says, and Nehru was circumspect about it, when he said that it was not going to be easy. The author argues that these two aspects have mostly gone unrecognized by India's leadership after Nehru on page 5. The preface outlines the author's aim as serve as an input into the meaningful discussion of how India's economy should be structured to enable a better life for its citizens. Unquote. The motivation for writing the book, as the author says, was that the current view is that we have made no progress at all prior to 1991. That's on page 6. It's similar to my motivation when I wrote my Indian economy book in 2013. Came out in 2013, I wrote in 2008-9. Because my students felt that economy began in 1990. So I had to say what the economy was earlier. Such a misconception can only be corrected when people understand what has been achieved in different regions of India in different periods in the last 75 years. So the author splits up the span of these years into 4 periods based on what he sees as turning points, based either on political developments or a significant change in economic policy regime, which is how he defines on page 7. The first period is the Nehru era from 1947 to 64. The second one is the watershed from 1965 to 1990, when the economy faces a variety of challenges and there's political turmoil. The next phase is return to the world from 1991 to 2013, when the economy became more open than it had been in the preceding decades. The final period is labeled as momentum lost and covers the period 2014 to the present. The political turmoil of the preceding 25 years was replaced by one-party rule, but policy mistakes were made, so the economic challenges increased. The key issues that the book seeks to address are listed as: were Nehru's policies beneficial? Did the policies of Indira Gandhi set the economy back? What was the impact of Rajiv Gandhi's technical orientation? And has Narendra Modi's electoral promise of Achche been realized? These are some of the important issues that people ask these address these effects. The last chapter assesses how much of the goals of independence movement have been realized in terms of human development, so that the citizens can lead fulfilling life. An aspect of positive freedom. It defines the negative and the positive freedoms in earlier chapters. This is linked to societal transformation, which differs across regions of India, as spelled out in this last chapter. So in the breakout, basically, it addresses what happened during Nehru's years, and for that he addresses what happened prior to Nehru, because in a sense, in a historical perspective, you need to know where you are and where you are headed. So the pre-independence goal of the Congress Party was that free India would eliminate poverty, etc. And for that, the state would play a large role in the economy. The leading industries of the country in the Bombay Plan made a case for government intervention. Protection was accorded to industry for industrialization. Planning was instituted for optimal utilization of scarce resources to maximize growth and reduce poverty. The second plan, which was the significant plan after the planning started, emphasized capital goods, not consumption goods. This was to speed up growth in the long run by simultaneously creating capacity and generating demand in the economy. But as the author says, the issues of saving, inflation, food supply, balance of payment, and exports were not directly addressed, not addressed as much as perhaps they should have been. But this did not mean that there was no role for the private sector. So the public sector was given priority, but did not mean that the private sector did not have any role to play. It was to be controlled for the sake of optimum resource allocation. And what he points out is that there was a remarkable turnaround in the Nehru era compared to the earlier 50 years during the colonial rule. And he gives data that all the sectors showed remarkable improvement. But because the population was also rising, the per capita income did not rise as much as perhaps one would have wished for. But in my judgment, the population increase itself, in a sense, shows development during that period because the death rate came down. He points out further that there's a crowding in of private investment. So as public investment increased during Nehru's time, there's a crowding in of private investment as well. But what he points to is the shortcoming was inadequate emphasis to education, especially at the school level. In this respect, the authors point to the different approaches between Gandhi and India's ruling elite, which wanted to quickly catch up with the modernity of the West. My own experience, when I switched from physics to economics, I went to rural areas to do some development work in Hoshangabad. So the elite was very feudal in its mind and did not want the poor to get educated. So the local landlord would come to us and say, why are you teaching these guys? Who'll take my goats for grazing? You should teach these guys. So in a sense, the feudal elements were very dominant in that period. The second period, the watershed, the author says that the period 1965 to 1991 was the most interesting phase on page 56. After a decade of stagnation from the mid-60s, there was an acceleration of growth, he points out, over the next 3 decades, and he links that up. Indira Gandhi's ascendancy and the food crisis in the country when she took the reins of power, the forced devaluation of currency by the US and the World Bank acting in concert, and other pressures they exerted. So Indira Gandhi took a leftward stance to begin with. She only turned pro-business in the 1980s, as he points out. Private investment dropped, did not revive for some time. But the question is, was it a result of decline of public investment in the crisis years? When it revived in the late 1970s, it did so at a time when there were a lot of controls. And to on the back of growth in manufacturing that it took place. Now there's a Jantar rule also, but that was also turning pro-business at that point of time. But I think that's not something that has been discussed in the book. The author argues that it was the Green Revolution that spurred late growth in the 1970s. That's on page 69. But the question also is that this Green Revolution had an environmental impact on the environmental degradation and mounting food stocks later on. So he points this out. He also points out that the growth of the services sector accelerated, and not so much the manufacturing sector. The question is that was there technical change which led to this growth of the services sector and the concentrated production that was going on. He also debunks T.N. Srinivasan's argument that nothing happened till 1991 liberalization on page 15. So the economic record of Indira Gandhi was successful, but it was a style of politics that was a problem, as he says on page 86. The author then moves on to discuss Rajiv Gandhi during this period and notes with, in a positive way, the technology missions that were there, that he initiated, and that, according to him, led to a mindset change. That accelerated private investment and ended the sense of hopelessness on page 90, as he says. Then the next section is the return to the world. This is the part where there's an integration of India's economy with the rest of the world, as he says on page 95. It's also pointed out that the Indian economy is unlike the Soviet-style economy, because people believe that the Soviet-style economy and that's why it wasn't doing very well. But he points out that's not the case. And he looks policy changes that took place post-1991 into internal and external policy changes. But part of this was the conditionalities that were imposed by the IMF and the World Bank at that point in time. And he also points out that India's professional economists pushed India to adopt the Washington Consensus. That's on page 23. Rajiv Gandhi had already set the train in motion by downplaying the public sector undertakings. And here I remember in 1991 when the economic policies were implemented, there were 35 public sector undertakings that were headless, and they were going down here. The outcome was a greater opening up, but neither the manufacturing sector growth nor that of the economy as a whole increased in the 1990s. It was only after 2003-04 that the trend rate of growth improved. And it's the services sector that grew the fastest and brought about a structural change in the economy. The author concludes that the NEP, the new economic policy, had limited success. The next section is momentum lost, which is the period of the Modi's rule since 2014 to the present. Modi begins when the economy was recovering after the high inflation, balance of payment difficulties, high fiscal deficit, and perception of policy paralysis in the UPA 2 period. In the election campaign of 2014, the author points out that many promises were made, like, for instance, the minimum government and maximum governance. But the author points out that from the very beginning, the focus was on fiscal discipline. And there's no roadmap how to achieve these promises that the Prime Minister was making at that point of time. He argues that the policies had an ideological rather than evidence-based approach on page 151. But the growth rate after rising started falling after 2016-17. Unemployment rose sharply. In spite of the pro-business postures, private investment as a percentage of GDP did not rise, while the public sector investment stagnated. So there's a policy-induced crisis that was brought about by demonetization, which damaged the economy without undermining the black economy. Then he deals with the COVID crisis and how the government dealt with the COVID crisis and points to the issues that came up of deaths and so on. India's rate of growth fell very sharply, more than that of any of the other G20 countries. It also underlies the inadequate investment in health in India over a long period of time. And what he points out, the economy hardly recovered from the shock of the pandemic and lockdown till now because of fiscal fundamentalism. So the momentum is lost. Now, the last chapter is an unfinished journey, where he points out that, if we have to have development, if we have to have progress, then we have to concentrate on social sector expenditures, education, health, and so on. The author correctly asks towards the end, why poverty is tolerated to such an extent in India's democracy on page 29. He argues that there are formal rights guaranteed by the Constitution, but substantive freedoms are missing due to policy. And he puts the blame for this on the permanent bureaucracy, which has changed little from the colonial times, on page 232. So policymakers have been talking about inclusive growth without achieving it. The blame is put on Indian democracy, where the political parties have become more prominent than the people. And here I'm reminded of Gandhi in the Hind Swaraj, where he talks about why the British democracy is not appropriate. So expansion of freedoms, the project has suffered a setback. That's the conclusion on page 230. Thank you. Thank you, Vinay Sitapati.
Can everybody hear me clearly? At the back there. Okay. How many of you, I'm curious, are first years who just joined? And how many of you have 875 rupees in your bank or your pocket? How many of you? That's it? Okay, please spend it. The book is right outside. And I would recommend it hugely. I'm not an economist, maybe that's why Bala got me here. And I used it to learn about economics, right? So I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you why you should buy this book, why this 875 rupees in your pocket should not be in your pocket anymore. And then, because I enjoy a good debate, because I used to be a journalist, list out a bunch of criticisms, critiques, or even agreements. But I think Bala should have made the point even stronger. So I'm going to do that for about 12 minutes. Then Professor Arun Kumar is going to speak his critique, and then we're going to have a discussion, right? The best thing about this book is that it's accessible and easy to read, right? I mean, if you think about economists and economic books as boring tomes, this is not one of them, right? The book is clearly written with passion. Bala has a view. He lets you know that view. But what I find remarkable is that while he's letting you know his view at different stages of the economy, he's also telling you what the debate is. So on the question of the acceleration of the Indian economy in the early 80s, he points to somebody he disagrees with, which is Roderick and Subramaniam, lists out and is very fair to what they say. So he even quotes them directly. He doesn't make a straw man version. And then he proceeds to critique them. And this is littered throughout the book. And I think it's a great way in which you know the various debates from the Nehru period onward. And you also know Bala's distinctive take, right? I think it's a comprehensive book. If you want to know why Modi did demonetization, why Modi is obsessed with inflation, you don't have to begin with 2014. Indian history begins before that. And Bala connects the British period, the Nehru period, the Indira years, the liberalization years to the Modi years. It also offers a pretty stirring defense of Nehru, and I'm going to come back and push back a little bit on that. It's a defense of Keynesian economics, especially in the Modi era. It's a criticism of Modi's fiscal consolidation, his reluctance to spend, especially during COVID, to increase public sector spending. And it's also a stirring defense of social democracy, defined as a focus on well-being, specifically health and education. So if there's one normative thread, not just descriptive, but what Bala believes and should encapsulate good economics, it is this focus on education and health, which, as he points out, has been sadly missing in conversations on political economy. There are many new things in the book. I didn't know at all. I mean, I didn't know most of the things, but I specifically didn't know about the role the Green Revolution played, not just in increasing Indian food security from 1978 onwards, but also improving GDP growth. And we don't have to look far. You just walk out of Ashoka campus. This is the Green Revolution area. These are the farmers who benefited from, increasing technology when it came to high yield seeds, minimum support price, government procurement prices. These are the farmers who benefited from that. And also in the Modi years, it's very analytical. Any discussion on the Modi years can be, eulogy or hagiography or attack. He doesn't do that. He's very calm. He's very analytical. So I learned a lot. My main pushback is his description of the Nehru years. Now, Professor Arun Kumar has just described what Bala says, but just to summarize the core Nehru view on the economy, also known as the Nehru Mahalanobis plan, the second five-year plan of 1956, was to close off or to largely close off India from the outside world in terms of import substitution, in terms of export pessimism. Internally, the state would push for growth. The state would be the vehicle of investment. Though, as Professor Arun Kumar says, it's only a little later that there's a direct pushback against the private sector and an emphasis on capital goods rather than consumer goods. Right? Build steel plants, not shoes. Now, my own sense is that, and Professor Bala correctly points out that the data in terms of GDP growth in that period, which is the Nehru period, is 1947 to 1964, that the data pretty clearly shows that GDP growth was good, inflation was low, and many sectors of the Indian economy was doing well. My basic question to Professor Bala on this is twofold. Firstly, how does one disaggregate the positive economic effects of decolonization, of sovereignty, right? Of the British leaving and Indians finally being in charge of their own economic policies to whatever Nehru did, right? Even if anyone else had, if Patel, for example, had been Prime Minister, just by virtue of being sovereign, just by virtue of having power over your own economic decisions, there is bound to be a GDP growth, right? In fact, in decolonized countries as disparate as Malaysia, as Indonesia, even Pakistan, as Brazil, as Burma, as the Philippines, you ended up with a GDP bump, growth bump immediately after independence. Because, and that, more than anything else, it tells you the scale of economic loot that took place because of colonization, just by virtue of the British leaving, just by virtue of Indians investing in India, you ended up with GDP growth, right? The second general question I have is that I agree with Bala that by the 1950s, there was a global consensus in favor of planning. I get that. But there is planning and there is planning, right? There is East Asian planning, which is capitalist, which believes in capitalism, quite similar to how Bala describes the Green Revolution. But the state plays a role in helping capitalism work, right? Versus state-directed socialism, which was much more what you saw in Soviet Union. Again, there was planning in Britain, post-war Britain, there was planning in the United States, but what the nature of the state intervention was changed dramatically in these different countries. And it's not obvious to me that while there was consensus for planning in the 1950s, that consensus was the Mahalanobis plan, right? In fact, there's an excellent recent essay by Aditya Balasubramaniam on the various critics to the second five-year plan, right? Though Bala is absolutely right that many economists, many global economists, as well as, of course, the Congress party supported the second five-year plan. So I wonder that if instead of using the breakout period of 1947 to 1964, which is what Bala does, if we break this up into two periods, one is 1947 to 1956, which is the pre-second five-year plan period, and we look at GDP growth and inflation during this period, it's more easy to attribute this not to Nehru, but to decolonization, to the economic effects of independence. And if we actually do that, we find that Indian growth during this period was about 4%, and inflation was minus 2%. So India did very well. Ironically, immediately after Nehru's second five-year plan of 1956, if you look at the data between 1957 and 62, you find that growth has actually lowered to about 3.7%. Inflation has dramatically shot up from negative -2 to about 2.5%. This is even starker between 1962 and 1967, right? This is the end of the Nehru regime, when growth has even lowered even more to roughly 2%, and inflation has skyrocketed to about 8.5%, right? If there are any supporters of Indira Gandhi here, you would say that if you become Prime Minister and you inherit your father's economy, where you have 8.5% inflation, declining growth, what option would you have but to turn populist? Because traditional economics or state-driven economics has failed, right? So what I am suggesting is a bit revisionist, but it's a little more sympathetic to Indira Gandhi and a little more harsher to Nehru, that the economy that Nehru left Indira with, which should accurately be measured between 1956 and 1967, was actually not as good as if you include the first years, which I would attribute a little more to decolonization or the benefits of sovereignty. The second general point, I can talk about this in detail, but we'll do this in the question answers. I'm just going to highlight this. The second powerful new argument that Bala has, I had no idea before I read this, was the impact of the Green Revolution, right? And this is a theme throughout Bala's book, that Indian policymakers from Nehru upwards have generally ignored agriculture, right? So crudely put, the people who are our neighbors, the farmers who are our neighbors, played very little part whether you're left wing or right wing, in economic policy making in India. Right? The Green Revolution was an exception to this. When high yield variety seeds were introduced into Indian farmers in this area, there was government benefits, minimum support price, procurement prices, and not just the food yields go up, but there was a dramatic improvement when it came to GDP growth, even under a socialist economy. And I think that's very powerful. I think you should buy that book for the argument alone. I would only have hoped that Orient Black Swan, I hope there's some representative here, I made that a separate chapter because that's a separate argument, slightly unrelated to the Indira years, at least until 1978. But my only pushback on that, Bala, is that the way you describe the Green Revolution sounds like capitalism. It sounds like Indira Gandhi, against her instincts, decided to trust the farmers to respond to the profit motive, right? Of course, she aided them, right? There was governments, but she aided capitalism rather than the state taking over production. And if that is the case, Bala, while I agree with you that T.N. Srinivasan is wrong or is basically maybe overstating it when he said nothing happened in the Indian economy until 1991. The larger point that the supporters of 1991, such as me, I've written a book on the subject, have is that the Indian economy has grown when the state has enabled the private sector. And if you buy that general argument of 1991, then your analysis of the Green Revolution fits into that. That when the state begins to trust Indians, begins to enable private sector, but understands problems in capitalism and intervenes insofar as there are issues, that's when growth happens. That's what happened after 1991. And that seems to be your description of the Green Revolution itself, right? So I know this is not the spin you put to the Green Revolution, it's a spin, provocative spin that I'm putting there. Third, I enjoyed your description of 1980s growth, right? That India was growth even before Narasimha Rao, even before 1991. In Indira Gandhi's second term and in Rajiv Gandhi's first term, there was some growth that was happening. But as we all know, it was unstable growth. In 1981, a few years after the Green Revolution led growth, India took the largest loan it had taken at the time from the IMF. India faced a severe balance of payment crisis. Again in 1991, the famous crisis, India took a loan from the IMF, and what followed was a dramatic alteration of the economy, right? So even though there was change happening in the 80s, it was fundamentally unstable. And it tells us something that it's only after 1991 that we've never had to go with a begging bowl to foreign agencies for money. So to me, that shift seems quite fundamental, right? And as I pointed out in my own book, Halfland, don't worry, I don't want you to buy that book too, right? It is that the ideas that the Nehru-Mahalanobis plan was basically not working. Policymakers in the 1980s were aware of this. There was the P.C. Alexander report, there was the L.K. Jha Commission report, there was the Montek Singh Ahluwalia's famous M document. Rakesh Mohan, by 1988 itself, had come up with a new industrial policy, which Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh implemented in 1991. The ideas were there. But someone like Rajiv Gandhi lacked the ability to navigate the politics of reform. He lacked the ability to navigate the Congress party, he lacked the ability to navigate parliament, the media, etc., etc. And that's just an addition, and maybe I'm just plugging my own book, to the general argument of the 90s that political leadership matters, that even when you have enabling structural conditions, the opposition to change sometimes is so high that you need politicians and leaders with the guile to see change through. Finally, Bala, I learned a lot from your chapter on Narendra Modi. I liked actually how dispassionate it was, because otherwise you say Narendra Modi and everybody gets angry or they love it, right? And this is dispassionate. But the core argument Bala makes is that Narendra Modi's economics is, you can call it neoliberal or even conservative, in that he's obsessed with fiscal consolidation. So he wants to make sure that whatever the government spends, it's roughly similar to what it earns. He doesn't like doing external borrowing, right? He's obsessed with keeping inflation low. That again is a political decision. The price of onion should not rise whatever happens, right? And as we all know, Narendra Modi's main interest is the next municipal election happening in 2 weeks. That's how that's his focus, right? So I get that. And I also see your argument that Narendra Modi has made an attempt at formalization, which is to move India's informal sector formally, either through GST or an unwitting consequence of demonetization or digital payments, UPI. I think you can use that outside, by the way, right? But the puzzle that remained is something, Bala, that you pointed out, that despite all this Modi has done, private corporate investment, so private sector investment by corporates is still low, right? So that's a bit of a puzzle for us political scientists. We thought big business would love this man, right? And yet, when it comes to putting money on the table, big business, foreign investors, private Indian investors don't seem to trust Narendra Modi, right? And you point that out, but I would like you in the conversation to tell us why you think Narendra Modi is not we think he is for these private corporate investors. Those were just some of the comments I had, Bala. Once again, please buy the book, even and especially if you disagree with it. Thank you.
And then we come back and have the conversation after you finish. And with all
So, as has been already pointed out, the book is rich and dense with arguments on the economy and some aspects of the political economy. Every page has some new arguments. The running thread is that stress on growth in agriculture, public investment, factors unlike private investment, or why that private investment is lacking in some periods, and above all, need to boost social sector. That goes through education, health, goes through various chapters. But I think what we need to do is, what in my own analysis, we need to appreciate the difficulties of policy making. From Nehru's time onward, the difficulties keep increasing. I think in the 50s, there was much larger consensus on policy than later on. And these, are a result of what I call crony capitalism, which was growing all the time, and the fractious nature of the politics that had come to play in the country. Inequalities have been growing also, and that, in my judgment, leads to greater instability in political, social, and economic terms. So we need to focus on the inequalities perhaps more. And what I've been arguing is that policies have been based on trickle down, and that's why the inequalities have increased. But there are two paradigm changes in policy making in India. One in 1947 and the other in 1991. The 47th policy paradigm was that the individual is not to blame for the problems that she or he faces. So a poor person cannot give job to himself, cannot eliminate his or her poverty, cannot give education to him or her. So it was decided as a collective that the state would play a large role in the economy. In 1947, this was turned on the head. And the policy paradigm became the individual is responsible for his or her own problems. So whatever you need, if you need job, go to the market. If you need education, go to the market. If you need help, go to the market. So I call this the phase of marketization of policy. So the two big things are the 1947 policy paradigm and the 1991 policy paradigm, shifting from where the state was going to play a large role to where the marketization process would begin. Now, the whole narrative is a long run narrative. Now, in the long run, many things can change within the short run to take off. So what Higgs says, what are parameters become variables, and what are variables become something else. So we need to be very careful about what kind of long run analysis we have. Say, for instance, in the long run technology map, what has happened to technology? That is something that we need to think about. And you can see that recently we were about to sign the RCEP agreement. At the last minute, we backed out. We'd gone there to sign it. We backed out. Why? Because technology-wise, we have lagged behind in the world. And therefore, we realized that if we joined RCEP, China would dominate. don't join ourselves, we still be at a loss because we'd still be trading with the same nation. So why did we get stuck? It's because of technology. So Bala, I would have loved to see more emphasis on what has happened to technology in this entire period. And that's the long run. In the long run, if you're not able to correct the problems that you sense are there, like the problem of education and health, then there has to be something fundamentally wrong with the policy making. Because long run means you have the space, you have the time, you have the thought process. And this is where I have characterized this as colonial disruption. That colonization disrupted society, not just in terms of physical, but also in terms of our mental makeup. You know, we began to be copiers rather than the original thinkers. And this is where I argue that knowledge generation is the key, socially relevant knowledge, and we lag behind the socially relevant knowledge. We've been copying knowledge from various places. So I think because it's a historical narrative, the emphasis on what happened pre-Nehru and then coming on to Nehru perhaps needed to be a bit more so that we could understand some of the reasons why the post-independence period has been a certain way. Another long-term thing that we need to think about, before that, when Bala is theorizing about what happened in the Indian, the question is, how does an economist explain things? What is the meaning of an economic explanation? We need to think about that. And this is where I'm attracted to Sweezy's idea. Sweezy's idea that, you know, economics method is like peeling the onion and getting the core and then putting the layers back. And that's how understanding it. So the core is very important. What's the basic minimum core? So, for instance, if you think of the difference between Kalitsky and Keynes, even though both of them came to the same conclusion that, you know, you need state intervention to take the economy to full employment. You know, now in Kalitsky, there's conflict between capital and labor, and that is the basic core, and that doesn't go away. So he says at the end you'll have political business cycles. So politically you'll decide whether to boost the economy or let the economy go down. You know, you won't go for full employment. But Keynes has, you know, harmony. There's no conflict. It's individuals and firms. Okay. There are no different kinds of individuals. You know, there are no capitalists and workers. Okay. So you reach the golden age. So therefore, in terms of methodology, I think it's very important that we see how we explain things in economics. And this is where I'm reminded of E.H. Carr. You know, what is history? How do we pick our facts? You know, it's what is important is determined by the core, and we pick our facts accordingly, and then we do the analysis. And that's why there are different schools of thought in economics, because different people will pick up. You know, for inflation, there will be several explanations. You know, because the core is different for different. Then, you know, another important thing is because there's so much of empirical analysis, you know, so much data that Bala uses to actually pull the things together. But is the data correct? So I would like to see an analysis of how accurate is the data. Because any empirical analysis, if the data is incorrect, would also turn out to be incorrect. So your analysis is as good as the data that's there. And you know, what is clear is that the GDP data has large errors. So when we discuss growth, you know, especially in the recent period, you know, there's been controversy. You must have all seen that. Those of you who are from economics or those who are otherwise interested, that post 2011-12, the new data series that came is very controversial. That also suggests that the data, earlier data of 2007, 8, 9 was less growth than what the earlier data suggested. So we need to have something on that. And this is where I suggest that greater focus needed to be placed on public finance and black economy. Black economy, which according to my estimate in the EPW article in 2016, soon after demonetization came, I estimated to be 62% of it. So if your 62% of your output That's a huge thing. And it has grown. 4 to 5% was estimated by Caldor in 1955-56. It has become 62%. So what I have been arguing is that it changes the composition of the economy. Because the black economy is concentrated in the services sector. As it is, the services sector, the dominant component of the economy, but if you include the black economy, it becomes similar to the US economy where 80% is services. And agriculture, which is 14% of GDP, becomes only 6% of GDP. Now, therefore, the emphasis is agriculture, which has led to a step up in growth. If agriculture is such a small part, it cannot be the cause. It has to be the services sector in the black economy, which are doing things to the growth path. So I think that is very important. Now, very often the economists have simply assumed that black economy doesn't matter. And it would not matter if everything was in the same proportion. But as I said, services sector is much larger, agriculture is much smaller. So we can't assume that everything can be multiplied by a factor of 1.6 and will come out right. Savings rate rises, the investment rate falls. So we can't assume that we can multiply the savings rate and the investment rate by the same this thing. Also, the investment rate falls because of flight of capital. But the incremental capital output ratio rises. Okay. Why? Because investment productivity goes down. As I characterize the black economy, is like digging holes and filling holes. So you set one person to dig a hole at night, you set the next morning, you set another person to fill the hole. So you have zero output, but two incomes are coming. So I call this activity without productivity. So investment is not keeping the productivity that should have come to the economy. So from growth theory, what it suggests is that your potential rate of growth has been shifted down. So I've shown that the potential rate of growth of the Indian economy is 5% more than what the declared rate of growth is. So the economy is characterized by 4 different rates of growth. The white economy's rate of growth, the black economy's rate of growth, and in between the two, the weighted average, the actual economy rate, and then the potential rate of growth. So what we need to discuss is the potential rate of growth. And this black economy affects all the macro areas. I'm saying savings, investment, and because of flight of capital and other things, the capital movements that are taking place, it has opened out the economy. So again, arguing that Indian economy opened out much before 1991, because you would take your capital out and bring capital back through round tripping even before 1991. You know? So then you sort of had a capital account convertibility even before 1991. Now, the question is, what is the cause? And Bala sort of hints in the book is the bureaucracy, the permanent bureaucracy that did not change and that dominated India. Okay? But my argument is that the bureaucracy by itself, there has to be an underlying triad of the corrupt businessmen, the corrupt political class, and the corrupt executive. The three have to work in tandem if the black economy is to survive. If even one of them doesn't do it, it won't survive. So in a sense, we've taken hundreds of steps. There have been, apart from what Vinay mentioned, the PC Alexander Committee report of 78, the NKZ Committee report of 78, there have been at least 14 committees and commissions that have gone into different aspects of the black economy. Like Panchu Committee in 1970 is rich with information and has made hundreds of suggestions. So we have thousands of suggestions on what to do with the black economy. We understand it fully, and we implemented hundreds of them. Like the high tax rate of 97.5% in 1971, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the finance minister. At that time, if you took the wealth tax and the income tax together, then for any income above 15 lakhs, the rate of tax was 101%. So nobody could be richer than 15 lakhs of income per annum. So there have been hundreds and hundreds of things that have been implemented, cutting down tax rates, reduction of controls and regulations, etc. Voluntary disclosure schemes, the bearer bond scheme, and so on. Hundreds of things. And yet the black economy has grown from 4 to 5% of GDP, 55, 56 to 62% according to me by 2012-13. So what is that doing to the entire economy? It changes the entire narrative in a sense. So the black economy to me is a crucial, what I characterized in my EW article in 1999, the missing dimension of policy. Neither are policymakers taken into account, nor do the analysts take it into account. But that that is a missing dimension of policy making that needs to be brought in. The other thing, as I said, is technology. Now, why did we not do better in technology? Why is it that we lagged so far behind? What is it that in our policy making? And that again links up to what Bala said about education. But more than that, is the environment for research and development. I wrote a paper in PW 1987 when the software policy was changed. And because my brother-in-law used to run a company which used to do software development. And my brother-in-law said, we are finished now. We are not going to develop, we're simply going to become traders. And that's what happened. The software companies, they started trading in the software from the US, whether it be Lotus or it be Word or other such programs, they simply became traders. So software development was set back by a huge amount by the software policy of PT7. And this is something that has happened repeatedly. Whenever you come close to developing technology, that technology has been undermined. So you take C-Dot for instance, which under Rajiv Gandhi, which you mentioned, Sam Pitroda was brought in and C-Dot was set up to set up telecom. Okay. They developed the racks for 128 lines. They developed the medium exchange racks for 2000 lines. And they were developing the large exchange. By then, 1991, the new economic policies came, C-Dot collapsed. The best minds there were recruited by the multinationals. And what happened was that at that point of time, Ericsson and everybody offered 2 lakh lines free to India to experiment. And C-Dot collapsed. Now, this kind of story you see during the Janata regime. BHEL had absorbed the 62 megawatt technology, the 122 and 120 megawatt, and 220, and they were going to 500 megawatt. But the agreement with the Russians was broken. All the technology fell. We went for an agreement with KDW for 500 megawatt, and they said, we are not giving you technology. Okay. So that technology development also. So repeatedly you can get examples from fertilizer, from power, and so on, where technology development is undermined. So you need to look at that. What was it? And I think black economy is one reason. If you can make profit easily, you don't need to compete. Okay, then why develop technology? You can buy technology. So that is something that I think but also there's another aspect of technology which I've been highlighting, that technology is a moving frontier. What was the high technology of 1950s is today's low technology. So technology keeps changing. So today's high technology is not producing steel and coal and so on, which is how the US and USSR used to compare with each other in the 50s. Today it is your space, it's your biotechnology, it's your nanotechnology and these technologies. So we've lagged far behind in that. So I can go on, there are many things that I would love to see. But I'd say I greatly enjoyed reading the book and recommend it to everybody with lots of things, because it triggered lots of thoughts in. Thank you very much.
I don't need that anymore. So, Vinay and Arun, as you've spoken in that order, terrific. I really couldn't have hoped for a better and more intelligent reading of our book. I might say also sympathetic reading of our book. But I greatly enjoyed listening to your comments. We'll try and respond to some of them only because we probably are running a little out of time. We want to flow to more discussion. Partly, my memory is not as good as it used to be, so I can't say I have retained all your comments in mind. So I'll go in order because Vinay spoke first. And Vinay, please don't hesitate to. I wouldn't ask Arun to do that. So to answer me and remind me of stuff that you said that I haven't answered. I would like that very much. So I just want to make a comment about the growth in the Nehru era. One of the you're right about the. Well, let me just start by saying if I might say so. Well, let me start by saying what you're right about. You're right about the growth having picked up in the early 1950s. You're absolutely right. But that doesn't mean the Nehru Mahalanobis strategy, Sukumoy Chakravarti's term, I cite where that term is used first. um, speak to the strategy having been broadly in the mind of the Indian political leadership, and in a sense, probably he doesn't say that. I'm saying that implemented from the early 1950s on, though specifically the the Mahalanobis model was the underpinning for the second plan. But the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, which is conceived of in 1938 during the brief presidency of Subhash Bose, presidency of the Congress of Subhash Bose, when something called the National Planning Committee was set up. And Nehru was the chairman of that, as you know. And that's when, if I'm not mistaken, Mahalanobis was a member of that committee also. I think that's correct, but it better be correct. It's in print. It's too late to be flagged. So the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy was conceived of by the late 30s. And I would say that it already somewhere informed the first plan, though the Mahalanobis model comes in only in the second plan, as you correctly say. Because if you really look at the investments made, they are made in actually some infrastructure, but essentially these river valley projects, etc., which have also come under criticism, and I mentioned that in a while. So in some ways, the revival of growth in the 1950s is not entirely, is not independent of the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, I would say. Now, I just want to say two things. You're also correct, Vinay. You're absolutely right that many countries which were decolonized showed a revival in growth. That's absolutely correct. Pakistan, too, that's entirely correct. But now the significance of this is, so therefore the critique that the Nehru era was wasted, nothing really happened, etc., I think is completely untrue. Yes, Pakistan may have done it, but that doesn't mean that what was achieved here was completely insignificant or wasted in any sense. And I would think that actually the impact of the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy begins to be seen over the long term. And here the role of Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy becomes clear. Mahalanobis interestingly imagined as a result of his the investment strategy underlying this plan, the economy will keep accelerating over time, and specifically it's because as the scale of the economy rises, fixed costs in the industrial sector are spread over larger output, profits at the public sector surplus, private sector profits increase, the capacity to invest rises, the investment rate rises, and the economy will accelerate. So in some ways, the acceleration that we have seen later is not unrelated, I put it mildly, to the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, which begins to be implemented from the early 50s, and the Mahalanobis model, which underlay the second plan. And it's in context of that model that Mahalanobis makes us claim the economy will accelerate over time. Now, where I think it's I do not say that, and nor do you say the way that I say that, but where I would disagree is that the Nehru-Mahalanobis model was not about shutting out the rest of the world, making India in some ways autarkic. It was really about investing in the capital goods sector in particular, and investing across the economy. Now, that you don't see in the model, but you see when you read about the debates of the time. Ashok Rudra, do you know the name? Arun and I know because he was still an active economist when we were students. Rudra talks about Mahalanobis mentioning, using this phrase, the plan, it must be a drama. And the sense in which it is used is that it must shake up the economy because you're investing across the board. And it's very close to this idea which was developed by this Romanian economist who went on to, I think Romanian, went on to teach at MIT and was part of the MIT India project called Rosenstein-Roda. And the expression uses the big push. Interestingly enough, it was imagined for Eastern Europe first. Now, the minute Eastern Europe is said, don't think of communist Eastern Europe. This is non-communist Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe nevertheless, and to develop, including southern Italy, and it was thought of as a way of developing it. And in some ways, that is what the Mahalanobis strategy did. And I just want to make a small point which I make in the book. I think it's important to separate out the model from what was attempted in the plan. Mahalanobis himself, I mean, he was by then one of the world's leading statisticians, probably second only to Ronald Fisher, so he probably didn't need to prove anything. And he says very flatly about his model that he thought of it as scaffolding to be dismantled as soon as the point is made. So he himself probably didn't spend too much time on it, while economists, I think, probably spent a little too much time talking about its mathematical properties, etc. Having said that, yes, in fact, import controls, even import controls were not so much part of the 1950s. They come on later. In fact, that's why you have a balance of payments crisis in 1956, because you know import controls. If you complete your target, you wouldn't have a balance of payments crisis. What happened was the consumer goods were sucked into the economy. There's a little bit of politics there. I'll come to that in a minute. But it is the case that if you are having a grand strategy of investing in a big way in the economy, especially public investment, raising the investment rate very substantially, then for any economy, if you have a highly open economy, the aggregate demand will just spill out of the economy through import. So in some way, some kind of import control when you're investing in a big way, especially government investing, is a meaningful thing to do. Otherwise, aggregate demand spills out. But there's something else here. The politics is an interesting thing, nothing you mentioned. The balance of payments crisis which comes exactly at that time, 1957, it almost seems to suggest that Mahalanobis model is responsible for that, actually happens because the finance ministry liberalized or allowed the use of these sterling balances for consumer goods imports. And the suggestion is that there was rivalry between the finance ministry and the planning commission. And T.T. Krishnamacharya, who considers himself a socialist, etc., was finance minister at that time, was not so sympathetic to what was being done. And that's where the liberalization of consumer goods imports takes place. Since you're a historian, that's you're interested in history, I'll send it on to you in case you don't have it. In the official history of the Reserve Bank of India, there is a discussion of that period. And you will see, I think if you read it, you'll be able to see that it's really, the Mahalanobis plan necessarily didn't have anything to do with that. It had to do with the liberalization of consumer imports at the wrong time, but also makes the point that actually to increase aggregate demand so much and to allow to spill out in some way of the economy via imports, some way defeats the purpose, because the idea should try and raise the level of activity domestically. Now, I just, if you don't mind, I don't know how much time we have, Vinay. Maybe I should wind up quickly. But sorry, Vinay, you said lots of other things. My mind is not so good. Do you want to tell me something of
the Green Revolution?
Green Revolution.
Why is it not a pro-market argument? Why is your argument not a...
Okay, I remember, but that's exactly what my sub heading says. Vinay, what is the subheading? Chanting socialism equals planting capitalism. So that's what, and I use that. That's what she did, Indira Gandhi, and I think completely correctly, and thus suggests that Indira Gandhi could be completely practical when she wanted to. I mean, she was a very intelligent economist, but politician, and it's very it's easy to miss out some of her economic intelligence because of her politics, including in the economy, the clamping down on capitalism, capitalism in such a way, and that section is called by me the capitalist strike back, and then easing up. I don't particularly think she was business friendly, became business friendly. That's a Roderick Subramanian term. I'm not sure she did very much. She did something, and I talked about that, right? She sort of gentle import liberalization starts at that time. But she's shrewd. She's political as hell. And there's a sting in the tail. Immediately she amends the Section 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. And what was earlier firms required permission to shut down firms more than 100 workers. She makes it 300 workers. That is just, kind of virtue signaling or, political correctness signaling or whatever. Personally, if you ask me, if there's anything in the labor laws should go, that is what should go. I mean, if you cut out exit, it's a terrible thing to do. People will be afraid of investing. The other things in labor laws requiring a certain amount of security for workers, etc., makes perfect sense. But exit is terrible. If you have exit, you won't have people entering. It stores entry immediately. So yeah, I agree with you. Complete exit. I don't use the word business friendly. I think that's Rajiv Gandhi. And thank you very much for suggesting that I'm fair to Roderick and Subramanian. I think that's even though I'm very critical of it, I think it's a very stylish argument. It's some racy political economy. It's very, very nice. It's just that it doesn't square with the evidence so well in my reckoning. That's about, sorry. Anything else you'd like to
Why does the private corporate sector in India not trust Modi?
Thank you so much. That's very, very important. Well, the first and very important point to make is that without using that term, Narendra Modi has positioned himself as someone business friendly, right? Undoubtedly, and his period as Chief Minister of Gujarat in particular has shown that. Let me just be a bit mischievous and say, I'm not sure if it is correct to say corporate investment, corporate sector has not invested. You're quite right, investment rate hasn't risen, but some investors have done rather well. Worryingly, two of them, they soon got after Vinay, and soon if they want to go to control news media, we had it. We'll have to be grateful for living in this bubble here in Sonipata. So, anything else? So, did I answer that? No, I didn't answer that. Well, as I say, that section is called the unconvinced investors. And whatever Narendra Modi has said about minimum government, maximum governance, that seems to have struck no chord whatsoever. Basically, I think from 2011 onwards, there's a slowing of the economy. In fact, in all fairness to Modi, in the investment rate is fixed, so what's the right word? Stagnates in 2011, right up to even now. If I'm not mistaken, the aggregate remains unchanged, and even now it has not reached 2011. So generally, the trend, the fluctuation, the cycle, the trend has been kind of slowing since 2011 onwards to some extent, it seems to me. And the corporate investor probably saw nothing in the Modi economic strategy, which suggested a buoyant economy. So that's really it, I think. And we don't have disaggregation, so that's not necessarily difficult to do, though you probably have to still do some inferring rather than have ready-made data to do that. Is the market at the lower end growing fast enough? I mean, market for four-wheelers, maybe even two-wheelers is growing. Now four-wheelers going faster than two-wheelers. But the base market, basic consumer goods, industrial consumer goods, is it really growing? I don't know. I've been reading of late, actually, despite this fastest growing economy in the world, etc., that the real wage, today's newspaper actually coming down, the real wage has been negative growth. I mean, the real wage has declined over the past 2 years. So investors are very savvy. They can see this. You know what I'm trying to say? And they probably, probably they're not convinced of the economic model. But I also want to say something which I don't develop very much in the book, because I don't think it's necessary to bring that in to explain the failure of Modinomics for want of a better word. Clearly, despite all this ease of doing business, India is not a very easy place to do business for it. Why do high net worth Indians leave the country, right? A very large number of millionaires are leaving India. If India was a good place to do business, and I would say this more in the second term than in the first term. This kind of leeway given to the enforcement directorate and the income tax department to just, just come down and, suspected offenders will certainly have an impact on the investment rate. I think this is absurd, and this is probably much worse than Indira Gandhi ever did. I conclude my section on the Modi government by saying maybe perhaps the fact that the economy didn't revive under Modi and also is moving backwards from 2017 onwards is the collateral damage of Narendra Modi's main agenda, which is a cultural agenda. Maybe he doesn't care all that much, right? And as I said, big time corporate investors are savvy as hell. They can spot a good plan when they see it. And I would say from that point of view, although one of you were not very impressed by the Rajiv Gandhi period, a time when the Roderick and Subramanian, for which the Roderick and Subramanian argument would be completely valid. There was very nice term, no paper trail, i.e. no legislation whatsoever by the government, is actually the Rajiv Gandhi period. Corporate sector investment just hits the roof. I mean, it's clearly because they were convinced that here was a prime minister who was going to make a difference to the economy. Clearly, nothing like that has accompanied Narendra Modi's prime ministership in Delhi. And I just want to say, in all of this, which happened quite early in his career, demonetization hasn't helped, and the slowing of the economy can be completely linked to that. Now, I wanted to show some graphs, but maybe I don't want to hold the discussion up, but we've already spoken for a long time. So maybe Vinay will continue the conversation later. But thanks for those terrific comments. I enjoyed all of them. Will make me think very deeply. Arun, I thank you very much for your comments, which I really enjoyed. The black economy, I have very little to say about that. I'm sorry, I don't say much about that. Not because I'm not even completely sure that I understand it sufficiently to be able to say anything intelligent about that. Technology, you're absolutely right. For all the talk about technology in the 1950s, we are probably technologically backward as a society. But I just want to say, Arun, you can't say that it is because it is easier to make a quick buck, or one can't say it's quick buck in the black economy, investing in the black economy rather than investing on technology or technological growth. There was a huge government technological, what's the right word? Huge network of technological institutions. What the hell were they doing? They were not governed at all. They were not governed for results. I mean, that's where the network of agricultural research institutes did a sterling job in the 60s. They responded dramatically to that, high-yielding varieties of seeds, strategies for agricultural growth, etc. But I would say all of this is something we take a lot of pride in, the IITs, etc. Have been a bit disappointing in a sense, right? I mean, if you think of the university industry interaction, which is made so much of in America, you don't really need to be a technology buff to, even somebody, innocent of how technology works can see that the interaction in the Silicon Valley, Stanford, Hewlett Packard, and all the rest of it, nothing comparable had happened in India. Somewhere the IITs, etc., and the IIMs for that matter, have been turned into conduits for middle class, upper middle class aspirations that become for the IIT students who go off to America soon after they finish their BSc or BTech, and IIM students to join multinationals soon after their degrees. Until recently, now they pay pretty high fees in the IIMs, but for 45 years they were paid just extremely low fees, and I think we didn't give these institutions a mandate. Your job is to be concerned with the technological backwardness in this country and come up with solutions. And we seem to celebrate this thing that about 95% of the graduating class in Kanpur IIT or some similar percentage in Madras IIT goes off to, to the American university. I think it's naive, right, to subsidize higher education to such an extent and have your output completely go to. So we didn't govern these institutions in an intelligent way. But looking back, I mean, if there's any section of India which should be grateful to Nehru, it should be this group, right? The group which were part of the creation of the techno-managerial elite, for want of a better word, in the 1950s. And the IIT being set up in Italy, it's near Kharagpur. Italy is a little small town there, a village. In the 1950s, at a time when we were so poor, that was imagined, resources were found for that, etc. That's extremely impressive. But we didn't govern that. It seems to me, that's my sense. But I would say technology at another level, if you think of it, what the hell were we playing at to have so much of illiteracy and poor schooling for so long, right? To give you an idea, this is data that comes from the World Bank. India had reached only by about 2005 the level of schooling, i.e. the percentage of a certain cohort which has had secondary schooling, that America and Malaysia had reached in 1970 only by 2005. You know what I mean? That kind of neglect is just, crazy. I don't want to be moral and say scandalous. It's just what are we playing at, right? And I think economists have some answering to do. Either they are constantly fixated on the Soviet versus American model, while even the intelligent observers of the US economy talk of it as a mixed economy, which is a bad word in India, because the idea was you should choose one or the other extreme, which I think is stupid. Mixed economy is the right way to go. The United States is a mixed economy. So either that, or over the past 20 years, is kind of a highly macroeconomic approach. Everything is about macroeconomic stability and what is the precise measure of the budget deficit. It seems to be a mug's game for me, for as an economist. I think there's missing out so many things, technology, the kind of terrain of production, is a word that I like to use, which is where I talk about bureaucracy. I'm not sure if I take such a strong view about the bureaucracy as both of you have suggested, but maybe I do. That's why you reacted the way you've done. But as I said, in 1991, when we liberalized, we kind of just assumed that East Asian rates of growth are somehow going to descend upon us. And I have a discussion of the many things. And the main one I think I discuss is educational investment in education. But I also talk about the bureaucracy. And I say that in this very perceptive study of East Asia by the economist Robert Wade, it's called Governing the Market. And it's a very, very, but the great thing is the guys who govern the market were bureaucrats. I don't think India's bureaucrats ever really bothered to do any serious governing, either govern the market or, but that's because the politicians themselves really never had Korea was a dictatorship, right? And if as a bureaucrat you didn't pull your weight, you had not very good things waiting for you. The only politician who probably, didn't really think much of bureaucrats, but despite that, he got a hell of a lot out of them. I mean, this kind of investment in the 1950s would not have happened if the bureaucrats actually hadn't gone out and done the paperwork, right? Both Nehru, I mean, I don't think he was particularly impressed by them, both in terms of his social class and in terms of his politics and in terms of his education. He clearly saw himself as, I don't want to use the word superior, but a man who could certainly match the bureaucracy. He was not swayed by them in any way. And he got them to function. About that, there is no doubt. Now, there's no time to actually look at some graphs, etc. So maybe I should stop. Although I'm not sure if I've responded sufficiently to the many things that you've said, but technology is one of them. And I just want to say that the black economy there is a very important idea, and it's correct. But that's an argument for the private sector. What about this huge investment we've made in the public sector, in the CSIR, the regional laboratories, the IITs, and then another lower rung called the NITs, once RECs, then NITs. And if you think of it, it's all very intelligent, right? All this is being done in the 1950s. You gather for only some IITs, but then you have RECs, which are slightly lower, which involve lower investment, and you spread them across the country. And all that. It were tremendous things, but we just didn't get as much out of it as we should have. And somewhere the whole public sector began to be run for the benefit of the employees. As far as the educational institution, maybe for the children of middle classes, rather than contributing something to the country. So maybe I'll stop there. And Vivaan, thank you. Thank you very much. One of the things that both of you, I think, didn't really mention, which is a part of my, maybe I didn't bring it out strongly enough, part of my book is chapter 5, where I look back on, I asked the question, how should we assess India's 75 years? And I categorically state that I think it should be assessed in terms of the promises made or the goal of independence in 1947. And that is largely, to put it in a very general sense, that Indians would be able to lead flourishing lives, lead the kind of life they wish to lead, as Arun said, the idea of positive freedom. And then I make the point that it would be wrong to see India as a whole, because there are tremendous regional variations. Tremendous, and I'm just going to give you one example. If you look at the most recent index of multi-dimensional poverty by Niti Aayog 2021, the poverty rate, it is over 50% in Bihar and just over 1%, sorry, just below 1% in Kerala. That is the kind of difference. I mean, 50 times within the state which has the lowest and the state which has the highest poverty. You know what I'm trying to say? Now comes the question, how come in a country which we call democratic and where laws are more or less the same across the country, more or less, right? Maybe the central laws anyway, and even many of the other laws and the bureaucracy too. How come development indicators can be so wide? I mean, it's not just wide, but so wide. A factor of 50. And I make an argument that this has to do with the way democracy functions. Will public policy take into account the needs of those who have been historically excluded? And for that, for democracy itself to work in that way, you need some kind of, not some kind, you need social transformation. That's not an original idea of mine. It comes from the Harvard sociologist Barrington Moore. And I consider myself very lucky to have had an economics education which required me to read a sociologist. So Barrington Moore makes that point about transformation in Western Europe. And I think that's completely correct. And if you look at the specific examples, broadly the South and the West has had social transformation of a kind, which the North and the East has not had. But when we talk about the East also, I think we should be very careful, because the Northeast shows dramatic human development. And it's probably the part of the country where human development is highest, but that's also partly because they've not had hierarchical social structures, they're tribal societies, which have problems of their own, there's tribal rivalries, but generally probably there's greater equality and a higher status of the women. So I just want to say, I'll conclude this time really, Vivaan. So now, especially with all this about India being the third largest to fifth largest, what are we? The third largest, fifth by market exchange rates, etc. I think that is not to be poo-pooed at by any means. But we should really be looking at what is it that how should we assess the 75-year benchmark or this period? And I would say that there's a tremendous amount of what needs to be done, which is in terms of equipping the population with health and education. I just want to, what strikes me is there is Piketty's summary after he looked at growth and inequality, economic development across the world. And he concludes by saying it is education which is really the most important factor in reducing inequality or bringing about equality, and the most important force in development at the same time. I might just exchange growth for development and say that even if you want growth and not development, we probably need to worry a little bit about the standards of education we have in particular schooling. And I think a nice, of course, it's a political slugfest, but not a bad idea that Mr. Kejriwal makes these statements about 85% of government schools. I don't know whether he means government schools run by the municipal corporation of Delhi or in India are junkyard. That's how he's quoted. That maybe at least this will bring some attention to the kind of schooling that we have in India, which I think is fundamental for any kind of meaningful economy that we'll have in the future. Thank you very much. I think we have a lot of time. So yep.
Hi, yeah, so we can open the questions from the audience. I'm sure you have observations.
You might want to tell us who will sit next. So we can all respond. Yeah. Now that you why don't you give an opportunity and then we can ask.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Aane Sriram, and my question is addressed to Professor Pulapre Balakrishnan.
Right.
So, you had mentioned in your book that India's economic development has been divided into 4 distinct phases. So, India being an open economy is obviously has been influenced by any world events happening, and any economic policy in India would affect world events. So with reference to this, even foreign policy of India can be divided into these 4 distinct phases you have mentioned. So right now, considering the fact that India is somewhat in a good foreign policy stage all over the world, it has a good position in the foreign policy sphere, would you consider that to be India going in a good trajectory towards economic development?
Well, I just want to say something that good foreign policy is not a bad thing to have. I mean, so, but in a certain sense, and this is not an original comment of mine, it's an observation by this Polish economist whom Arun quoted, Mikhail Kaleski. In fact, India benefited, I'm not using the word good or bad, benefited hugely from its foreign policy in the 1950s. This is very interesting when it was non-aligned, a much maligned term, and had its problems maybe. But there's this comment by Kaleski that India was like one of those clever calves which sucked milk from 2 cows. So because there's a huge competition among the countries of the West to aid India. So but something which I just referred to in the book, but none of us really talked about the rise of India in the 50s and the Mahalanobis plan, etc., was aided by foreign aid. You can't completely overlook the role of foreign aid, foreign inputs, if not aid, but aid too, in the Green Revolution phase. That I think I mentioned, right? Norman Borlaug and the rest of it. So in some ways, India's foreign policy was pretty good. Even then, don't think it's muscular now. Is it very good? I don't know. I don't say it's bad, but it's very muscular. The Green Revolution had scientific inputs from Mexico in terms of seed, and Norman Borlaug, the great geneticist, was part of that. It had some assistance, maybe indirectly, by the Rockefeller Foundation, which financed these research institutions in Mexico, where the high-yielding variety of wheat came from. So India has benefited from Western in particular, but foreign aid in general, including Russian, and it couldn't have benefited from that in the 50s, right after the late 60s, if its foreign policy wasn't good. So I'm not sure if it was necessarily bad at that time. Of course, I think that maybe we spent too much time on it. But in the 1950s, we seemed to be, we were punching well above our weight in international affairs, had some kind of say in the resolution in Korea. A decade later, we had some kind of say in the resolution of the problem in the Suez Canal, etc., etc. It's not so clear to me that foreign policy is bad or something. So I'm not sure how else I can say. But having said that, all of that, foreign policy can help you only this much. Ultimately, you have to do it yourself, and you've got to choose the right policies. There's this great comment by one of Nehru's comrades, for want of a better word, people they were part of the national movement together. In the book, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, was he minister also? Yeah, minister of education. Right, he was minister in the Nehru cabinet, and he's quoted by a very eminent journalist called Durga Das, who in those days were really journalists. I mean, they're not cleaning the way journalists today are, in kind of showing off their learning, etc., etc. So he interviews Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, and Kidwai makes a very important observation. Jawaharlal is obsessed by world affairs. Doesn't he realize that in international relations, only economic might matters? So in some ways, you have to, foreign policy can help you only this much, appearances in the UN, etc. That is not a substitute for doing the right things yourself.
So if I may add, can you hear?
Yeah.
Developments at the international level have had a major impact. For instance, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 180-degree turn that China took, they've affected Indian policies as well very much. So if you look around, you find that there is a link. And today, with the Ukraine war, there's a problem because we got 60% arms from Soviet Union, and all the new arms are coming from the USA. And which side do we take? That's going to be a crucial thing. So we're headed towards a new normal where foreign policy will become very important. Yeah, let's take another question. Let's take a round of questions.
As you just said, you want to take a round? Up to you. You want to collect some?
Questions.
Yeah. If you wish to, ask their name and write it down, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Shadab, and my question is for Ms. Pulapre Balakrishnan. So my question is, was the decision taken at that time was best and justified to support the revolution, or do you have some other ideas or suggestions to share? Don't you think India should have also tried capitalist model of economy?
We're going back to exactly what I said was wrong at that time. This endless discussion about whether we should be capitalist or we should be socialist or be communist. What does it mean to say we should have been capitalist? Why would that have assured growth? That's not obvious to me at all. Why would that have brought investment by itself? That's not obvious to me. I just want to say, and here ties in with something that Professor Sitapati said. He's right that there was private investment in India, etc. at that time. But it's important to remember that public investment, and which is the Nehru Modi strategy, one element of it, expanded the market. It made it profitable for private investment. Private investment is not going to invest unless it thinks there's going to be a market for its goods, so the economy is going to grow. And that's exactly what we were talking about towards the end. The question that was asked to me: why haven't private investors invested after? So I don't know. I mean, I don't believe the mixed economy model, if you wish, or arrangement is was a bad one. In fact, I think it was a correct one. But for me, more than even the bureaucracy, though both my interlocutors have raised it as something that I say maybe I overplayed it, but that is not my intention. I think the main missing factor is a level and quality of schooling in India, and of course many other things too, which is infrastructure and the rest of it. You just look at Bangalore, you see that. I mean, the point about education is that it is conceivable that if the population was better educated, we might have had a better functioning democracy. Democracy, after all, is not only about what happens in the legislative assembly, it's also about what policies are adopted, whether those policies are intelligent. And I do believe it could have made some difference. With this kind of low levels of capability at the lower, for a large part of the population, maybe 30–40%, democracy was bound to fail. I mean, or the democracy was not going to be successful in transforming. So my answer to your question, no, I don't think necessarily things would have been better if we had, as you said, just been capitalist, whatever that means. I mean, I'm not sure what that means, but yeah. Because you still have to worry where the sources of growth are going to come from, where is the demand going to come from. And in some ways, to an extent, the Nehru strategy did address that question.
Good evening. My name is Vishakha, and you talked a bit about economic inequality across different states in India. So my question is, do you think geography plays a factor in influencing economic inequality, considering how northeastern states in India were for a long period of time, not included in mainstream economic development? And if geography does play a part, how do you think that we as a country or as an economy can bridge that gap?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't done too much work on that, except some kind of cursory look at the spread of variation in development across the country in Chapter 5. But there's an organization in Bangalore which is called the Center for Governance or something, who came up with a study which Ramachandra Guha had talked about in one of his columns. And what is interesting about that is that apparently that study shows that in 1947, much of India was at the same level. So geography, by definition, therefore, cannot really be a serious explanation. The explanation must lie in the policies which were adopted in different regions. And that's what I talked about a little bit in the last chapter. It has to do with how democracy works, for want of a better way of putting it. And how democracy works, it seems to me, is related to the kind of social transformation you have had in a society. And social transformation has progressed differently in India. And let me tell you about the Northeast. It certainly is not the fact that the Northeast was not part of the mainstream of economic development. The Northeast has invested very considerably in the social sector. Levels of literacy in Meghalaya, I think, are higher than in Kerala or something of that sort. The status of women, etc., etc. That could be partly cultural, but the fact that the women go to school and the rest of it has to do with some investment in the social sector, if not necessarily investment of resources, but investment in terms of governance, trying to bring into the mainstream and into education sections which were left out historically.
Let's have one last question from somebody in the left, right?
Good evening, thank you so much. My name is Abhay, I'm with UG24. My question is really for all three of you, but Professor Balakrishnan, since you brought it up at the end. You spoke about the social factors involved, and I would like to bring in Ambedkar, if that's okay. He says, right from Annihilation of Caste, that there will be no real progress if there is not social progress. And by that, of course, he means caste. And my question is, there are issues with how our economy has grown, and now there are issues now. So one, at some level, has there been that real progress? Two,
has there been what progress?
Has there been that real progress? Second sort of part of this is, Professor Sitapati spoke about a boost to an economy when, it retains freedom. And in Ambedkar's terms, we still haven't achieved that freedom because we are still fundamentally very casteist society. So when we achieve that freedom in his terms, wouldn't there be that boost? And lastly, just drawing from your comments that, you did say that Western India and Southern India has had some social progress.
social transformation. I also believe they've had progress. I have no problem in technology, but they've had social transformation.
Right, social transformation. But what I would also like to say is, as parts of, for example, Maharashtra have become more urbanized, things like caste have, at least to my knowledge, sort of transformed in how they apply to society. So while there has been some economic progress, it's still on this very shaky foundation because of caste. So what sort of explains that progress? Because caste still applies in those parts of society. Thank you so much.
All right, I just want to say something. The last chapter of my book has 5 comparisons. One is India and the rest of the world. In terms of social indicators, India, the investment India has made in education relative to many parts of the world, and surprisingly, schooling, it's a country which spends the least, even lower than sub-Saharan Africa. Then I have something which is regional variation, and then I have on gender, and the last comparison is caste, and it's called the imprint of caste. And I show that on every major indicator of economic and social development, the scheduled castes are worse off than the population as a whole. I don't look at the scheduled castes because they're relatively small. They're probably worse off. They're always a pretty good bet that they're worse off compared to the scheduled castes. But they're a small proportion of the country, but the scheduled castes are not. They're very significant. Now, I just want to say that the chapter also discusses Ambedkar. Ambedkar pointing out that democracy itself will not work sufficiently unless you have, he doesn't use the word social transformation, use the word social equality. So I'll talk about that. And as I said, the table is titled The Imprint of Caste, where I show this variation. But a small thing that I wanted to say, and this is quite strong, and I'm saying, and we can discuss this later. But now the question comes, what do you do with it? Now, there is a body of opinion in India that you need caste-based mobilization. Only that will do this. So I look at Kerala and Tamil Nadu, where it would be. I think we would all agree that Tamil Nadu generally for about half a century seen caste-based mobilization. I don't think that would be necessarily wrong. While Kerala has had what I would call a social democratic, I think Vinay is a term, social democratic mobilization for the population, where there is which is what social democratic in the West would be an economy which combines social welfare or concern with the distribution of well-being, economic resources, and a market economy. That's also. So I say that the mode of political mobilization in Kerala is social democratic. And it's kind of interesting that on every major economic and social indicator that I look across the country, for women, the rest of the population, the caste, for every major indicator, Kerala does better than Tamil Nadu. Now, this doesn't disprove anything of that you have said, but it does answer, but to be precise, the condition of the scheduled castes in Tamil Nadu is worse than the condition of the scheduled castes of Kerala when you look at these indicators. Apart from the fact that Tamil Nadu is also, some might say, so this is not something which comes up in comparative analysis of data. It's a state with very high incidence of violence against Dalits. It's kind of interesting, despite caste-based mobilization. So that's a small point I'm just going to say. So that should make everybody query a little bit about the political correctness or political efficacy of caste-based censuses. What is it that caste-based census is going to tell us that we don't know already? Yeah, and this small little example that it is possible, and socially, by the way, the kind of transformation that you've seen in Kerala is kind of unimaginable. The old elites are kind of decimated. I mean, they don't count. There's a tremendous, and that has been done by what would be called a social democratic. which has advantages. I think it kind of doesn't permanently keep alive these schisms, in my view, and has been in this narrow field more successful than the overtly caste-based mobilization of a neighboring state. Does that prove anything? No, but it is indicative highly.
Mala, in your last chapter,
Ah.
you refer to caste.
Yes,
You refer to Muslims.
I don't. I agree. Yeah, I don't. I don't look at religious matter. Yeah, I don't.
Because, as such a committee report,
That's true.
they're actually even lower than the.
That's true. But you're correct. Of course, we don't have an example of absolutely. No. I'm just saying we don't have an example of no mobilization based on kind of trying to raise a condition of Muslims. But I think it's a pretty good bet. I have looked at the data, but Kerala would come across as better than almost any other state when it comes to, except Kashmir, of course, when it comes to percentage of Muslims in governance positions, in the bureaucracy, etc. I'm almost certain about that. So once again, broadly suggesting that social democracy, which is trying to raise everybody's levels, equalize capabilities, and take care of hitherto excluded groups in a population, I think is the way to go. Rather than, rather than quite bluntly, identity-based politics of any kind. So I'm very happy to raise that. So it's not just caste, it's also differences of religion, it's also language. Just because we set up a state based on some regional language doesn't mean that we go to yield social democratic outcomes. So identity politics, I think, is Maharashtra is a very good example. Sorry to say, identity politics. If you recall the terrible scenes in Bombay during the pandemic, right? The first round in particular, no oxygen, corpses piling up in the main wards, absolute chaos. Apart from large number of deaths, identity politics has been quite serious in Maharashtra. At Bombay City, having historically had a very high amount of human capital, entrepreneurship, which seems to all have got subsumed under identity politics.
So, Bala, in this context,
Yeah.
you raised the question of COVID.
Yeah,
How reliable is the data on deaths?
Yeah.
And on this thing?
Yeah.
Because I talked to 25 people from 25 different districts of UP
right,
in May 2021.
right,
The Delta wave was at its peak.
right,
And there, all of them said that earlier we used to have one death per month.
right,
Now it's one death per day.
right,
You know?
right.
So numbers have shot up, but they are not reflected in the official data of UP. Second is that they said there are no doctors. So people are complaining of chest pain, of breathing difficulty and dying. But there's nobody to diagnose. So what you point out about the medical infrastructure being very weak, So in UP it's even weaker than what it is in Maharashtra.
Right. I'm sure you're right. And historically, there has not been so much identity politics in UP. But of course, there has been much less social transformation in UP, I think, compared to the rest of the country. Historically, by now everything is changing in the long haul over these past 75 years. A small, I don't want to prolong the discussion. Vivaan, I don't mind if we take it to 8:30. There's just 7 more minutes left. If it's all right, if it's all right by my plan.
Somebody else
please.
No, nobody's speaking. We can take one more question.
Good evening, professors. My name is Kunal Bansal. I'm a UG 25 student. My question is addressed to the entire panel. There was a mention of India not signing up for the RCEP partnership. So, what is your opinion on the? What do you believe that should have India risk Chinese dumping by joining RCEP to let India develop technologically when there is a popular belief and popular opinion that power will converge in the Indo-Pacific region in the future, that could India have taken a long-term view with respect to RCEP and partnership with the Asian countries specifically?
Yeah. So, my view of RCEP is that we didn't join at the last minute. We had gone to sign actually. And then there's an opposition from Swadeshi Jagra Manch and others that we shouldn't do it because it'll affect us badly. And our experience of other free trade agreements has been that we've actually lost out. That's why I raised the question of technology. Because if we were technologically strong, I think we could enter any free trade agreement and benefit from it. If we are technologically weak, then they tend to overwhelm us in terms of their exports and our imports. So, for instance, from China, technologically, we don't have the scale economy, we don't have the technology. They're even able to flood our markets with things that the small scale sector and the micro sector produces. Whether it be the Ganesh Murti, whether it be the Patang, the Manja, the cultural symbols and so on. Forget about batteries and about torches and fans and so on, which they've flooded us with. So that is the fear. So unless we become technologically strong, going into free trade agreements will always have problems for us. So my view is that what we have missed out in the last 50, 60 years is technology development. And that is the problem that we face with globalization. Because globalization is all about technology. Who has better technology? They'll be able to dominate, in the globalization process. So our problem today is critically technology.
So I just want to say that joining any trading group, etc., is fraught with a certain amount of uncertainty. But I think we should have joined ourselves without doubt. And I would say the point that Arun makes is absolutely correct. There's always a danger you could be flooded, or you will be flooded. But I just want to say this was also a comment, and the Swadeshi Jagra Manch was quite active then, and it was not their government in power. So they were particularly aggressive in 1991. It was the Congress government which was in power, Narasimha Rao, and they opposed it. And of course, a lot of left-wing intellectuals also opposed the liberalization of imports. I just want to say, I'm not a very strong opponent of liberalization of imports, but I just want to say the scare stories of that time certainly did not come true. Certain sectors like communications, etc., folded up. But in the aggregate, it's not as if the balance of payments really has had a problem since 1991. And you must remember that. And Vinay mentioned that. Vinay, of course, I also mentioned that in my book, that it's the longest period that we've gone through without a balance of payments crisis. So I think that it's very unfortunate that we didn't join RCEP. And as Arun said, I didn't know that. To have pulled out at the last minute really shows cold feet. It's very bad for foreign policy, very bad in general. We're a large country. We should have joined. And I just want to say, please remember, and this is your point about dumping, there are rules. You can't dump all that easily. By the way, India is the country, the litigant with the most number of anti-dumping, what are they called? Complaints is not the right word. Please, in the WTO. So, yeah, we can bring that up. There are rules about dumping. It's not as if they can be indulged in recklessly. And finally, after all, the small Southeast Asian countries, etc., also part of RCEP. I mean, shouldn't we? I mean, if we really think of ourselves as a great civilization, yeah, this is not a completely an economic argument, but we should go and have joined that without doubt.
But I just want to add to that a lot of the fears of the Swadeshi Jagra Manch now, the China will come, take away. Those are protectionist arguments that India has seen from the 1930s, right? That underpinned this idea that we should have a closed economy, because even in 1950, India was low in technology. Technology was outside cheap.
from northern England, cheap cloth would come and sort of take over India. So I recently read this book by Tirthankar Roy. It's a bit of an unorthodox book, but written in 2015, where he argues that even under these conditions, in British rule, under colonial rule, even with all these, inequalities in trade, in manufacturing there, in raw material here, India was one of the big cotton manufacturers in the world, right? And something that happened when you have open markets, which is a mix of domestic trade and domestic manufacturing, international trade and private banking, that works when you have open markets. So I'm always suspicious. It's true that you may have, these. It's a problem in India, but that argument has always been true, right? And then at least my own instincts, or maybe political instincts, is the solution is often worse than the identification of the problem. That a large state comes and intervenes. You identify the right problem, but the solution becomes worse. But that's again my instinct. So
you're absolutely right. No, I just want to say, Vivaan, if I may, Professor Arun Kumar's point about technology is absolutely correct. That we're backward, technologically backward, really, except some islands. But Arun, I just want to say, surely we have the technology to match production of torches and batteries, etc., etc. What we don't have is, I don't think we have a serious support from the political class at the state level where production actually happens to do something about manufacturing in a way that we had for food starting from the 50s. There were politicians there. There was a slogan called "Grow More Food," if you remember. Lal Bahadur Shastri had suggested missing a meal to see that food is shared. The first Mexican high-yielding variety of high-yielding seed for wheat was planted in C. Subramanian's front lawn in Lachins, Delhi. So Lachins is not necessarily a bad word, or need not be. So politicians were much more hands-on, if you ask me. Now they are constantly on Twitter preening. That's not why we've elected them. And we've elected them to build infrastructure to see that the electricity doesn't go off. I'm shocked that this is worse than it was 3 years ago. In Haryana, the electricity is constantly flipping. How can you have any kind of production if you have that? So we don't have uninterrupted power supply. So infrastructure is also. Sorry,
if I may intervene. Yeah. You see, R&D develops when you create an environment for it.
I agree.
We have not created an environment for R&D. That's been our problem. So you are right that we've created a lot of institutions.
Right.
But how many patents have they got?
Yeah. How
much technology have they developed? Very little. We've created IITs, right. And as you rightly said, we are only exporting our talent from IITs and IIMs.
Your wonderful expression, reverse filtration of data and column of yours.
So, the
reverse filtration with the best leave. So finally, you were left with not.
So what filters up to PhDs are the third best.
Unfortunately,
so second best go to MTech and third best go to PhD.
It's sad.
And then the teachers that you get in IITs are not
all three of us have
PhD. So we are including ourselves in that.
Not from IITs. I was referring to IITs and the IIMs, really.
But it's true about the system as a whole.
But the environment for R&D is very important. That environment for R&D where you promote R&D. And you don't, let somebody intervene to do it. And state intervention, if you look at all the nuclear technology, space technology, etc., in the US, that was first developed in government, and then it was handed over to the private sector.
The internet also.
So the internet, huge numbers of new technology was developed in the public sector and then passed on to the private sector, and then they did. But in India, we've systematically undermined public sector technology. So the environment for technology has been very poor. Second is, when we look at the impact of free trade agreements, we have to disaggregate our industry. So we have large industry and MSME. Okay, large industry, there are 6,000 units as far as I can tell. Those are registered in the stock exchange. MSME, micro units are 6 crore. Small and medium are 6 lakh. So 6,000, 6 lakh, 6 crore. So a factor of 100 each. It's the micro sector that's getting hit because micro sector does not have technology. And when you have these free imports coming in, it's this. And that's where of the MSME sector, 97.5% of the employment is in the micro sector. If you hit the micro sector, your unemployment situation will become far worse than what it is today. a small sector is also going to be hit. Because the problem with the micro and the small sector, the threefold, one is technology development, the other is finance, and the third is marketing. They don't have that. What did China do for the village industries and so on? They developed on the basis of providing these three things, which we haven't done. That's why I say create the environment first, make your industry strong enough to be able to withstand. If you just let it open out, it's going to get decimated. We'll have problems of unemployment, we'll have problems of technology and other macroeconomic problems. So I'm saying grade it. Realize that you're weak in technology, you realize that your production structures are certain, change that, act on that, then you can open out more easily. But if you do it indiscriminately at this point, you'll have even more problems in the future.
I really hate to cut this off, but we have to stop now. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Oh,
thank you everyone for coming here on behalf of the Ashoka University Economic Society. First, I'd like to thank the audience for coming here, giving us your time, and I hope you got as much out of this event as I did. I'd like to thank the panelists for a spirited discussion, and I personally think that a discussion that has both disagreements and synthesis is something that helps us learn the best. So I'd really like to thank the panelists for this and for the time and effort they've invested into this event. I'd also like to thank Professor Ratul Lankar for starting us off on a very bright note. And this goes fairly unnoted at times, but I'd like to thank the Ashoka University support staff who have really made this event possible. And finally, personally, I'd like to thank all the members of the Ashoka University Economic Society who have made this possible, and that includes our moderator here, Vivaan Gupta. Finally, to conclude, I would definitely say you all heard them speak, and personally, if you've had a conversation with Professor Balakrishnan or you've had a class with him, you know how engaging he is. So go out there, buy that book, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. Thank you everyone. Thank you for coming.
Now, I just want to say, please stay back for just half a second. The amount of work the students of the Ashoka Economic Society have put into this over the past 3 weeks is really stupendous. So can I request all of you, including you, Vivaan, to come up for a minute? Please, whoever the other person is, please come. All of you, this will take us 1 minute. Siddharth, Abhinav, come. And is there anybody else? Please, all of you, come. Hurry. We don't have time. Please come. And thank you very much, everybody. Please give them a hand. This has been made possible because of the efforts that they have put in. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. Today, dream